1861, the United States was at war with itself. 11 southern states were threatening to secede from the Union and had formed a separate and hostile government. President Abraham Lincoln knew he had a difficult challenge ahead of him to keep the nation together or watch it dissolve. Chicago would play a key role in the Civil War that would have a long and lasting effect on the country as a whole. Illinois was expected to organize, train, equip, and make troops available to the federal government to serve in the Civil War. Many makeshift camps sprung up in the North and South to do just that. Among these was Camp Douglas in Chicago. The camp, named after Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, would become infamous, but not for its training of soldiers. Camp Douglas would become the site of suffering, hardship, and fatal neglect of thousands of Confederate soldiers that would be detained at the camp throughout the war. It would rival the deplorable conditions of the Confederate prison of war in the state of Georgia, Andersonville. Lack of responsibility on the part of commanders and government and military officials would result in an estimated 6,000 deaths, the abuse of the rights of many more soldiers, and even the trampling of civil rights of innocent civilians living in Chicago. It wasn't until the victory of the Union Army over the Confederates in Donelson, Tennessee, that Camp Douglas would prominently become a detention camp for captured Confederate soldiers. Under the auspices of Ulysses S. Grant, about 11,000 detainees had to be accommodated. Due to miscommunication and lack of information on the part of military and governmental authorities, these detainees would be scattered to camps that were not conditioned or prepared to handle any prisoners of war, let alone large numbers of them. The Illinois Central Railroad brought an estimated number of anywhere from 4,500 to 7,000 prisoners initially to Camp Douglas. The pitiful condition of the Confederate soldiers and the non-existent services and lacking conditions of Camp Douglas, such as sewers, gas, sanitary conditions, and proper housing, would result in over 500 deaths at the camp within the first 4 months. Diseases like pneumonia, jaundice, measles, mumps, lack of clothing, blankets, good food, and clean water escalated the number of the sick. A series of turnovers of commanders and people in charge of the camp would also add to its dysfunctionality and chaos. Camp Douglas quickly became known as a death camp. The camp now fell under federal authority, and Illinois' responsibilities as well as its commanders were relinquished to their command. Here, too, federal authorities would fail to uphold basic human rights and neglect conditions that could have been improved. The camp had fallen into disarray and was deteriorating. It continued to function as a Union military training camp. An outbreak of scurvy, overcrowding of men, drainage and sewage issues, and filthy conditions prevailed. Plans to build sewers and refurbish the camp were rejected by Washington and seen as unnecessary. In 1862, Colonel Mulligan, Colonel Tucker, and Colonel Hoffman, all of whom oversaw the camp at various levels, petitioned Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs to improve sewers, build new barracks, and generally try to improve conditions throughout the camp. They were initially denied their requests. Eventually, some sewers were constructed, but conditions didn't improve.
There were a number of ways in which prisoners were tortured at Camp Douglas. The most famous of these was the mule, which is a railing stretched between two pieces of wood, two supports, on which the prisoners had to sit. Very painful for a man. That mule was put into effect about September of 1863 at Camp Douglas.
Men were also thrown into the White Oak Dungeon, 25 to 30 at a time. Men were hung by the thumbs as punishment for various offenses, such as trying to dig their way out of the camp. Men were told to stand at attention for hours and would be shot if they flinched. To discourage escapes, men were told to strip naked before going to the latrine at night. The floor in the sleeping barracks were removed and replaced by dirt, and often coats were confiscated in winter, also discouraging escapes. After many attempted escapes, sympathizers aiding in breakouts, and other conspiracies made against the Union by Confederate sympathizers, President Lincoln declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus in 1861 in Maryland and parts of the Midwestern states. This shocked many people and is still debated for its execution. Provoked by a plot to attack and overthrow the Union government by a dissatisfied Marylander named John Merriman, who attempted to stop Union troops from marching into Washington, a writ of habeas corpus was sought by his lawyer. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney declared President Lincoln's actions unlawful, but the military and President Lincoln would not release him. These actions, no matter how well-intentioned they may have been, were later officially found to be illegal. Lincoln had basically nullified established law of the U.S. Constitution in the name of national security and safety. In order to further squelch any uprisings, President Lincoln carefully debated this issue and upheld his decision. President Lincoln would later expand martial law and the suspension of habeas corpus nationwide on September 24, 1862. When threats were made and a plot was uncovered to storm Camp Douglas and other northern prison of war camps by Confederates in 1864, the commander of the time, Colonel Benjamin J. Sweet, extended martial law from a few blocks surrounding the camp to encompassing the entire city of Chicago. Many doubt the complete legitimacy of this threat, but some evidence verifies at least parts of it.
For the first time in its history, and probably the only time, the city of Chicago came under martial law. Colonel Benjamin J. Sweet became the most powerful man in Chicago's history ever, probably rivaling even Mayor Richard J. Daley, because he had the backing of the Army and was making arbitrary arrests.
Real or not, this threat and subsequent actions taken to stop it resulted in the arrest of 81 citizens throughout Chicago, most of which were civilians. With the suspension of habeas corpus for those in military custody, detainees could be held indefinitely without question or legal counsel. They were in fact detained for months. In the end, 14 civilians would end up dead. Their lawyers argued that it was unconstitutional and against their civil rights to be tried as civilians in a military court. Nonetheless, even when a verdict was found, it was kept secret, which violated the Articles of War, which stated a verdict could not be kept secret. These actions also violated the Lieber Code, which was signed into law on April 24, 1863. This code dictated the humane and ethical treatment of populations in war and the conduct of soldiers at wartime. By November 1865, after the end of the Civil War, Camp Douglas was dismantled and the property was sold or returned to its owners. An estimated 26,000 Confederate soldiers had passed through the camp, and as many as 6,000 deaths occurred. Many were buried in unmarked paupers' graves in the city cemetery, which is now Lincoln Park. Later, they were moved to Oakwood Cemetery, where a mass grave is marked by a memorial. The failures of Camp Douglas were many. Some were intentional, many were not. The responsibility to maintain the humane treatment of prisoners of war and protect the civil liberties of those accused of conspiracy with a just and fair trial was ignored. Of course, in times of war, laws of conduct are subjective at best, especially when the preservation of the nation is at stake. People, institutions, and even our government have the responsibility to protect the rights of all of its citizens and still uphold the laws and principles that the United States was founded on. Officials from Camp Douglas, up to and including the President of the United States, willfully ignored our own established laws. Yet it is arguable that the commanders of Camp Douglas and President Lincoln did what was needed to be done. Some rights had to be denied, not in declaration of war, but rather in the suppression of rebellion and the preservation of our great nation. The intentions of our great president were noble, but if we set this precedent, can we be sure that the future leaders will be that honorable and look at our country's best interests? If these circumstances were presented to us today, would we be confident in our leaders? There's a Latin saying, inter arma silent leges, which means, in time of war, the laws fall silent. Our nation should be strong enough to withstand times of trouble and uphold the laws that make us great. We must never forget the rights of those who, even as enemies, paved the way for the rest of us. Men have suffered, often at the hands of those who had power and responsibility, to ensure the rights of all men were respected.